We're live with Jason Thompson and Randy Gott at Harpeth Hills Church of Christ. And guys, what we want to do is to talk to you about the changes that you have seen resulting from the pandemic in these last several months. And Jason, the other day at lunch, you had a wonderful line that I wish I could have captured at the lunch table, and you probably won't remember it, but it was something to the effect that our challenges and our foibles basically help us learn what to do differently. And so I don't know if you can capture that theme in your kind of ad lib comments. And Randy, what I would hope, well, for both of you guys, what's happened differently is, you know, eldership teams have worked with ministers. How have you guys adjusted to make sure that you're aware of what's going on, that you're supporting each other the right way, and that you're staying in touch with the members the right way? And then, Randy, for you, kind of a follow-up question, and I'll come back to this so you don't have to remember all that we're saying right now. But for you, the follow-up question really is, what's changed in terms of eldership practice? How have you guys stayed in touch with the flock, and how have you kept aware and helped each other be aware of challenges and ways that people can be helped? Okay, all right. So let's just kind of rewind and go back. What are the big takeaways so far from the pandemic for both of you guys related to whether it's ministry teams or as elders trying to help shepherd the flock? What have you learned through this pandemic?
Well, I mean, I'll start with Randy and I have had this conversation a lot. Churches of Christ that are strongest often have a real shared sense of ownership and leadership among the ministers and the elders. And there is a shared partnership in advancing the gospel, advancing God's kingdom. And that has served us well because as a priesthood of all believers movement, our partnership has been a great example for the rest of the church, a unifying effort. Randy, what I've struggled with, I know you and I talked about this, is that model has been cumbersome in a fast-moving, rapid culture. And you've had to work with other organizations besides churches. What would you say about that?
So, a crisis is an accelerator. And when a crisis occurs, you know, there are challenges that are immediately right in front of you that you've got to deal with, but you've also got to recognize that you're going to have to make some changes that, let's just be frank, you probably wouldn't have even thought about doing when things were normal or back when things were normal. And there are also things that you think, you know, we'd like to try that, but you didn't have the courage to do it because things were going so well. Well, when you're in a crisis, that's an opportunity to make some changes, and things can move really, really quickly. From an eldership and a minister's partnership perspective, you know, we had immediately, when this occurred, we had to respond and basically anticipate some things that may or may not occur. So, for example, we sat down and said, you know what, we need to be prepared to deal with people who get impacted by COVID. From a health perspective, we had to deal with people that may lose their job over COVID. We had to be prepared for people who were already health compromised, who may be homebound, who were now for sure going to be homebound. And we had to be in a position to respond to those groups of people, I would think, as a immediate priority. And so we put in place systems to address those people. And then we said, okay, we've also got to be ready to communicate with the congregation at large. And so we had a ministry system, or a shepherding, I would call it a shepherding model, that we call Barnabas. And it was a way that we were able to keep in touch with membership. But even all of those things still feel quite a bit inadequate because there's so many things that have impacted us in terms of being separated, and so we've had to there's a lot of trial and error that have gone on in this process.
We have definitely had to learn from our mistakes, but we've also had to not be afraid to fail. And so we probably have a little bit more of a risk-taking attribute to our leadership right now than we had pre-COVID-19. There's always been this tension between form and function. And I would say the old song about hold to God's unchanging hand, we had to take the things that don't change, the function of the church, the care for the one another as described in Scripture, the being a light to our community, the worship of the church. And where we've landed, and I think where we'll stay, is that we believe there's three movements right now for our future. One is a gathered people. We still believe that the church at Harpeth Hills will continue to offer assemblies here on our property. Two, we want to think about the church in smaller groups and have micro churches, and we've had house churches that have been a place where folks can worship. Yesterday I went to your house church, and it was a big circle of people praying with each other, being together, and it probably looked more like first century Christianity looked than what we do here in the worship center, the auditorium. And then the third is, and we're just barely moving off of home plate as a church, we believe there's got to be a strong digital presence. So how does the church advance the gospel? How does the church put the hands and feet to the gospel? We think it's going to be a gathered assembly, some smaller assemblies, and then a strong digital presence. Well, that's the big change for the church, to resource that, to help the people who have been coming here for years to understand those changes, and then also who are the right personnel to lead those. And so we're just in the very beginning stages, but our commitment is to those functions in Scripture that the church should be. And all of our ministry teams have been having to reframe ancient practices. And we're very committed to the ancient church, but we want to see the ancient church have a bright future. And doing that has been trial and error. I think back to the first question, Randy, I think we've been doing that, but we've been making mistakes along the way, adjusting and trying to make the same mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up our digital presence. A crisis highlights your weaknesses. Things that may have been there all along, but because we were doing really well, our membership was up, we had a great budget, we just don't mess with the good thing. Well, it's like the old NFL coach and legendary sports broadcaster John Madden used to say, winning is a great deodorant. And it's true, because when things get a little bit awry, then your weaknesses become apparent. And I think one of those, a good example of that, is our digital presence. We really hadn't focused on that at all. And all of a sudden, this happened, and it was a glaring weakness that we are still struggling with. How do we address that, and how do we address it well?
What other questions do you have for us?
That is great as a way of leading in. Why don't you both kind of talk and just keep doing what you're doing back and forth with each other. How have we stayed in touch with members differently? What are the things that are working, and what do we still wish we could improve?
Yeah, so I mentioned a minute ago about our Barnabas groups. So, Barnabas groups, we started those 3 or 4 years ago. They've had their strengths, they've had their weaknesses, but I think it has really served a good purpose during this pandemic, because it's a way that we have broken the congregation down based on social networks to shepherd people. So we've used those to maintain person-to-person contact as best we could. We've encouraged elders to have communication on a regular basis with their Barnabas groups. We as an eldership do a weekly letter to the congregation that's put out on email. So those are the ways that we are doing it on a broad scale. I think on an individual basis, unfortunately, it's some crisis management, because it's when a crisis happens that we, are able to come in. And then even there, it's not like we're free to go and visit someone in the hospital or even someone who's sick. You're doing so many things remotely. It's like yesterday at the house church, someone mentioned that one of our members had been tested positive for COVID. Well, I think in talking to her husband yesterday afternoon, I think their phone was ringing off the hook yesterday afternoon, and he said, did you send pizza to our house? And I'm like, no. He said, well, we just got a pizza delivered, and I don't know who sent it. And then he said somebody else had been to Cool Cafe and grabbed a meal and brought it and put it on our front porch. That to me is church, and unfortunately that's not scripted anywhere. And so you're seeing smaller groups address those needs. The issue comes for the people who maybe aren't as engaged. John, for example, you're a good example. You had some health issues a few months ago, and I think you commented. You were hearing from people, people are reaching out, people are dropping banana bread at your front door. All kinds of stuff like that. So that to me is, it has been a real cool thing that's happened out of this, but I do worry about the people who are still walking alone.
Let's break that down a little bit. Harpeth Hills has been over 1,000 people for 2 decades, and so we want to remain a small church. We want to feel the intimacy of a small church. So, Randy, you mentioned the intentionality, and this is important. Churches have to be intentional of having systems of care. So there's got to be care so that everyone, no matter if the person has 17 friends or just one acquaintance, that everyone's cared for. So there is a systematic approach to care, but then there's just the natural flow of the love of Christ in people's lives. And I think that's a good evidence of both of those. Some of those things are happening because we have a system of care in place, and then some of it's happening because we want to be that kind of people. Yeah. We want to care. Nobody cares much about anything we're proclaiming if they don't believe we're authentic and we're real. I would say to a church that has 100 people in it, don't think you're not big enough to still have a system of care. And if you've got 3 elders, decide how to shepherd 3 different groups so that everybody's job is nobody's job, or that elders are everywhere but nowhere. Don't be afraid to take your church population and subdivide it into smaller groups, having one shepherd caring for that group. Our system has 18 shepherds, and then every shepherd has about 3 or 4 partners we call Barnabas leaders. And so, Randy, you have 4 Barnabas couples, 5 couples, and then they're working with you and Debbie to care for 75 people?
75 or 80.
Okay. So it's the old principle of how do you manage, well, how do you care?
Yep.
As well.
Yep. And even that systematic way of doing things, you just still have those people that they get missed, and they're out there dealing with a mother who's in hospice care, and they feel like they're walking alone.
You have mentioned what I think is a best practice of taking the membership that you have and the elders that you have, and then actually assigning so that you know you're reaching out and you're touching people on a regular basis. What other best practices have you discovered as an eldership and ministry team to stay in touch with the flock?
Well, I would say that leadership begins with listening. And we really wanted to hear from people during this time. And so I feel like we had an open door policy. Elders, ministers, we really wanted to hear. We want to know what's going on, how can we help? And then I think we also have we've done 2 surveys that I know of, that where we have listened and heard the thoughts of our people, and we've made decisions based upon those survey results. Add to that.
I just think it's got to be whatever model you choose to shepherd the flock. It's got to be proactive. There's always going to be a reactive element to shepherding. There's always going to be the crises that you have to deal with. But you need to have a proactive model that says, you know what, I'm not going to wait for the crisis to occur in somebody's life. I'm going to put a person who's basically kind of has their eyes on that person on a regular basis and is constant communication with them on a regular basis so that they're aware of things that may come up.
We've had to also be aware of how do we care for each other. I mean, this has been a stressful time for elders and for ministers navigating this, and it's a good time to work on that relationship. It's a good time to remind each other how God's gifted the elder or the minister, the good that God's doing through them. And Apostle Paul calls us to a ministry of encouragement, and we've tried to encourage each other on this journey, and yet encourage each other, but still be centered in that our job, our responsibilities to advancing the gospel, not trying to make Randy feel better about Randy or Jason feel better about Jason. How do we encourage each other, but yet keep on moving forward? One of the things that I'm passionate about right now is that the world is changing so rapidly, and if the church is longing to go back to something that used to be, we're going to see the whole world pass us by. There's going to be an even larger disconnect between the world and the church. So how do we kind of get out of the whining mode? Because there's been plenty to whine about during this year. So how do we get out of the whining mode and just hoping and praying they will go back to normal? And how do we lead people to Jesus Christ? How do we be the church that's on the move, not just responding?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something that I have said for years, and that is, who shepherds the shepherds and the ministers? And this has been a stressful time. People who were hired to be the ministry of this are all of a sudden realizing, you know what? I need to repurpose and be the ministry over this. That's a stressful thing for somebody in a job who thinks they're doing one thing one day, and all of a sudden 30 days later, their job description changed, and they're having to do things that are totally different that they didn't even think about 6 weeks before. That's stressful for people. So we have to be conscious of how each other are doing, make sure our mental and spiritual health is good. So I feel strongly about that, and always have, that we have to shepherd not just the flock, but shepherd the shepherds and the ministers. And to mention what you said a minute ago, this is not a church thing. This is an organizational thing that says, you know what? When things get back to the way they were, we're going to be well positioned. Well, you can't think about it like that, because very well be that it may not get back to the way they were. And so you have to be preparing yourself for what's coming in the future. So for example, we used the digital media thing a moment ago, electronic media, as being something that we really haven't focused on here. Well, you know what? Now in the pandemic, it's very important. And guess what? I don't think it's going away, because there's a segment of people who have now become accustomed to watching live stream, watching things online, and they kind of like it. Or they may feel uncomfortable coming back to a gathering in a room like this. So, you've got to put forth, and organizations have to put forth, or churches have to put forth, a first-class digital presence. And, it's almost like you're putting together a production every week.
One of the things that I really have appreciated, I think, one of our youth ministers, Hayden Parrish, is to be part of this conversation that NationsUniversity, Christian Chronicle, and some other groups are putting on. But our children's ministry and our youth ministry never stopped doing ministry. And they just started reframing. They started reconditioning. Those two ministries knew hey, our job is to help young people and their families grow closer to Jesus. So how do we do that in new, fresh ways? And how do we not let anything be a ceiling for us? And I don't think children's ministry or youth ministry ever stopped at Harpeth Hills Church.
The thing I love about that is, I alluded to it a minute ago. You know, Hayden, for example, he was hired as a youth minister, and he knew how to do that because he had done it before, before he came here. Well, all of a sudden, doing youth ministry in March and April was very different from youth ministry in January and February. And you thought about, okay, well, what about camp? What are we going to do with camp? What about vacation Bible school? What do we do with that? You know, you've got all of these events that are a big part of our ministry here in children's and youth. And we've seen those ministers make incredibly creative things that are, you know, outside the box, that have just been ultra successful.
They had to challenge themselves to make sure that the events were not the end result. They were just means to change lives. And so those ministries took a whiteboard and just totally cleaned it off and said, how do we change lives? How are we part of ushering the kingdom of God into the presence of our families, to our children, our teens, and their parents? And so we saw really creativity happen in those two areas. And to your point earlier about how do we all do this together, right now, if I had to give any encouragement to Harpeth Hills, Randy, it would be to live in this tension of how do we stay united, but how do we keep moving forward? And that's just going to be a tension for any church. You know, we're going to have to keep moving forward, and it's going to be a tension point for leadership in the church to go, whoa, we used to have services at these 2 times. And now we're going to be having services at these 4 times, plus online, plus at a house church.
And that to me is a really cool thing, because you know what? We may have thought about doing these micro churches around Williamson County for a long time, but may have never pulled the trigger on it.
That's right.
And now we're saying, you know what? We kind of used an opportunity to do it, and it's been really successful.
You know, I'd ask you as an elder to share, what would be one advice you would share with other elders? Like, if you were with a group of 100 elders and you had just one thing to share with them, what would you share with them?
There's a lot of things that come to mind. The one thing that comes to my mind is the significance of the partnership between the minister and the elders. I mean, in our model, every minister is partnered with an elder. Jason and I happen to be fortunate enough to be together. And so you can probably tell that by the way we talk to each other, because we've had this conversation, although it hasn't been on video, we've been having these conversations for months. And, you know, this is healthy. Now, my wife thinks, why would Jason Thompson ever call you? Because she hears me, you know,
everything that's wrong.
Yeah. And, you know, she's like, why would he ever answer the phone when you call him? You know, but what this is some really healthy going back and forth that's challenging each other. So I get as much out of him as he gets out of me.
And mine would be, most of us got into ministry to not keep a church afloat, but to really be in the life-changing business. So ministers, here's your chance.
Yeah.
No excuses.
That's right.
You know, don't be afraid to fail. You're not trying to keep your church open. You're in the life-changing business.
And I would add to that while we haven't really thought about this in the past, we are in the business of equipping people more so than ever before.
And that's what we said at Churches of Christ, who I think are the majority of the folks watching this video. But most evangelical churches, Churches of Christ, Christian churches, we've always said the priest of all believers. We don't think elders or ministers have some special relationship with God that the whole church does not have. I mean, so we get to live into some of those beautiful things that we said were true about us.
Yep.
Wonderful.